Hello everyone, and good evening. I hope you are settling in comfortably, ready to drift into a story that might feel distant in time, yet close enough in imagination to touch your thoughts. Tonight, we are going to wander through a France that many of us only read about in textbooks. A France shadowed by war, uncertainty, and the strange, subtle courage of people caught in the tides of history. Before we dive deeper, I am curious, where are you listening from right now? What time is it where you are? It's always a little wonder to know that a story from decades ago can reach across time zones, across continents, and touch someone else's evening as they sit quietly, listening. Our story begins in a small village on the outskirts of Normandy, where the morning fog clung to the fields like a thin veil, hiding the furrows and the remnants of a summer that had long passed. It was in this village that Jean-Marc Leblanc lived, a young man barely 20, with hands calloused from farm labor, and eyes that had already witnessed more than any 20-year-old should have. The war had not yet arrived in full force, but the tension was palpable, lingering in the air, and whispered in every conversation at the local market or at the cafe where the old men lingered over coffee and cigarettes. Jean-Marc's family had always been known for their modesty and resilience. His father, Henri, had served briefly in the First World War, returning with stories of trenches and frostbitten nights, tales that Jean-Marc had grown up hearing beside the hearth. The stories weren't heroic in the way books often romanticize them. They were stark, practical, and carried the weight of real human fear. Henri would speak of the sound of artillery as something you didn't just hear, but something that settled into your bones and reminded you that life could pivot from ordinary to unimaginable in an instant. Jean-Marc had listened to these stories with a mixture of fascination and unease, and now, as the shadow of another great war crept over Europe, he felt those same tremors of anxiety settle into his chest. One morning, the village awoke to an unusual quiet. The birds were less vocal, and even the wind seemed hesitant, brushing the leaves and stalks of wheat with a tentative touch. News had arrived from Paris. The German forces were advancing, and mobilization was underway. Jean-Marc watched the faces of the villagers, some pale, some resolute, some already planning, in whispers, how to protect what little they could. He had friends who talked about joining the army immediately, seeking purpose in action, while others considered fleeing to the hills or hiding in the forests that skirted the village. The tension was like electricity in the air, buzzing beneath the ordinary motions of daily life. Amid this quiet dread, Jean-Marc found himself wandering the familiar paths of the countryside. The fields were still ripe with late-season crops, the soil rich and dark, and yet, the beauty of the landscape seemed almost cruel, a stark contrast to the fear settling in the hearts of those who lived there. He passed by the old mill near the river, where the water churned endlessly, indifferent to the anxieties of men. It was there that he met Lucille, a childhood friend who now worked in her family's bakery, her hands dusted with flour, a small smile playing on her lips despite the grim news. They exchanged a few words, cautious, careful not to let despair take hold. But each word was charged with the unspoken recognition that life as they knew it was about to change. As days passed, the village began to prepare. Men and women, young and old, organized what little defense they could muster. Some learned to read maps and follow radio transmissions, others prepared supplies, and still others tended to the animals and fields that would be vital for survival. In this midst, Jean-Marc found himself drawn to the stories of those who had already lived through the front lines elsewhere, tales that carried hints of heroism, horror, and the mundane struggles that often went unnoticed by history books. He learned of neighbors who had sent sons to fight in the mountains, of families hiding relatives in attics and cellars, and of the strange ways in which ordinary life persisted even under the shadow of occupation. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in muted shades of pink and gray, Jean-Marc sat on the edge of a low stone wall, looking out over the village. The wind carried distant sounds, the low hum of a train, the occasional barking of a dog, but mostly there was silence. He thought of the letters he might never write, of the friends he might never see again, and of the choices that lay ahead. Each decision, each movement, each glance could alter the course of his life and those around him in ways that were impossible to predict. And yet, amidst this uncertainty, there was a strange, quiet resilience. People were still planting, still baking, still talking, still hoping, even when hope seemed a fragile thing. It was during these hours, suspended between fear and ordinary life, that Jean-Marc began to notice the subtler details of the world around him. The way the fog shifted across the fields at dawn, the smell of wet earth after rain, the texture of the old wooden doors on houses weathered by years and stories, each scratch and groove telling its own tale. These were the threads of daily existence that would, in time, become the tapestry of memory, a quiet chronicle of a time when the world was unraveling, yet life persisted in its most delicate forms. The days that followed were thick with tension, each one bleeding into the next with a slow, persistent heaviness. Jean-Marc felt the subtle shift in the village, the quiet nods between neighbors as they exchanged information, the way conversations halted when a stranger approached, and the careful watchfulness in every glance. It was a world transformed by the unseen forces of war, and yet, in its own small ways, life continued. Chickens clucked in the yards, a cart rumbled along the dirt road, and the baker's oven, still warm with bread, offered a comforting, if fleeting, normalcy. Rumors began to travel faster than the trains. Some claimed that German troops had been seen near the coast, marching silently in the early morning mist. Others whispered that a French resistance cell was already forming in the nearby hills, men and women willing to risk everything for the smallest chance of reclaiming freedom. The truth was difficult to discern, and Jean-Marc, like many others, found himself listening intently to every fragment of information, trying to separate fact from speculation. There was a strange thrill in knowing or thinking that events of such magnitude were unfolding just beyond the horizon. Yet a cold fear lingered in the pit of his stomach. One afternoon, Jean-Marc was called to the town square. A few of the older men had gathered, their expressions serious, as if the weight of the world rested on their shoulders alone. They spoke of mobilization, of enlistment, and of the need to prepare for the inevitable. Jean-Marc's name had been mentioned. He would be expected to serve, perhaps soon, in ways he could scarcely imagine. The conversation shifted rapidly between practicalities and speculation, between fear and courage, leaving him with a swirling sense of urgency. That night, he returned home to the quiet of his small room, staring at the ceiling as if it might offer guidance, wondering what it truly meant to be brave, to live, and to survive when the ordinary rules of life were suspended. As the first shadows of autumn crept over the fields, Jean-Marc began noticing changes in people's behavior. A neighbor, previously cheerful and talkative, now avoided eye contact, muttering under his breath about some secret plan. Another, the village doctor, who had always been calm and reassuring, seemed tense, carrying bags filled with supplies and whispering about potential shortages. Even Lucille, whose bakery had always smelled of warmth and sweetness, now moved with a hurried, almost frantic precision, glancing at the streets as if expecting some silent alarm. The war had seeped into every corner of existence, and yet, in its quiet, persistent way, the village held together, a fragile network of routine and vigilance. One evening, while walking along the riverbank, Jean-Marc overheard a conversation between two strangers, travelers who had come from a neighboring town. They spoke of an unusual convoy, moving through the countryside under cover of darkness, soldiers whose uniforms were unfamiliar, their presence a puzzle that stirred both fear and curiosity. Jean-Marc strained to listen, trying to catch every detail, his mind racing with possibilities. Were they allies, enemies, or merely the first signs of a world that was quickly becoming unrecognizable? The unknown pressed upon him, sharp and relentless, a reminder that the safety of the village, and of every life he cared about, was no longer assured. Night brought little relief. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying faint echoes of movement, perhaps animals, perhaps people, perhaps nothing at all. Jean-Marc lay awake, listening, imagining scenarios both terrible and hopeful. He thought of his father, Henri, who had warned him that the world could change in an instant, and he understood now, in a way he hadn't before, the depth of those words. He felt a sudden, almost startling awareness of mortality, of how fragile the thread of life could be, yet simultaneously, a strange exhilaration in realizing that each choice, each small act, could ripple outward, altering the course of events in ways one could scarcely predict. Days turned into weeks. Jean-Marc found himself more involved in the subtle, hidden currents of village life than he had ever anticipated. He helped fortify barns, carrying supplies in silence. He listened for the softest sounds at night, noting which paths seemed most traveled, which windows remained dark, and which doors opened cautiously to reveal faces marked by tension and hope. Rumors grew more elaborate. Secret meetings in the forest, individuals disappearing and reappearing under strange circumstances, mysterious letters exchanged in the dead of night. The village, once simply a quiet pocket of routine, now felt like a stage for events far larger than its boundaries suggested. Lucille became a frequent companion on these twilight walks. She spoke of small observations, footprints in the dirt, unfamiliar horses passing the roads, whispers carried on the wind, each detail a thread in the increasingly complex tapestry of danger and uncertainty. Jean-Marc began to see the village through her eyes, noticing the subtle movements, the hesitations, the minute signs that something was shifting. Together, they pieced together fragments of information, forming a tentative understanding of a world that was expanding, threatening, and endlessly fascinating. It was during one of these walks, under a sky streaked with the muted colors of approaching dusk, that Jean-Marc first glimpsed the machinery of war in its immediate human form. A group of soldiers moving cautiously through the fields, their faces unreadable, their boots stirring the soil into clouds of dust, passed nearby. They seemed almost spectral, silent observers in a world that was only beginning to recognize its new reality. Jean-Marc and Lucille watched from the shadows, hearts pounding, a mixture of awe and dread binding them together in that quiet, fleeting moment. In the days that followed, the village adapted in ways both practical and psychological. Families gathered in hushed meetings, planning routes of escape, rationing supplies, and establishing communication networks. Jean-Marc found himself increasingly at the center of these subtle operations, not as a hero, not yet, but as a participant in the ongoing negotiation between fear and survival. And through it all, life continued in its ordinary rhythms. Children played in the yards, bread still baked in the early hours, and the wind continued to carry whispers, secrets, and possibilities across the fields and riverbanks. Perhaps the most striking aspect of this time, and what continues to fascinate historians and dreamers alike, is how ordinary human behavior persisted under extraordinary circumstances. The village did not crumble entirely. People found ways to laugh, to love, to maintain small rituals of normalcy, even as the threat of destruction hovered over them like a persistent shadow. Jean-Marc began to understand that courage was not only found in grand gestures or battles. It was often quiet, subtle, and deeply human, visible in the decision to continue planting crops, baking bread, or walking along the river at dusk, fully aware of the dangers that surrounded him. And so, as another night fell, Jean-Marc lay awake, thinking of what tomorrow might bring. He felt the weight of uncertainty pressing down, yet beneath it, a fragile thread of hope persisted. The story was unfolding, in ways both terrifying and beautiful, and he was a part of it, not just as a witness, but as an actor in the intricate, unceasing drama of human life during wartime. Autumn deepened, and with it, a subtle tension that seemed to tighten around the village like an invisible cord. Days grew shorter, evenings cooler, and the first hints of frost crept along the edges of the fields. Jean-Marc noticed it in the way people moved, faster now but quieter, in the way the smoke from chimneys curled straight up without a waver, as though the wind itself were holding its breath. Something was coming. Not tomorrow, perhaps, but soon enough to make every careful step feel laden with consequence. It began with small disturbances. A horse missing from a neighbor's stable, a letter left on a doorstep with no return address, and strange lights flickering in the distance along the road to the coast. No one spoke openly, but murmurs carried in every corner. Some saying that the Germans were closer than anyone imagined, others insisting that spies had infiltrated the surrounding villages. Jean-Marc felt a gnawing curiosity mixed with dread. The invisible threads of danger were becoming tangible, almost touchable, yet still frustratingly elusive. One morning, he was summoned by the village council, a collection of older men and women who had seen enough of the world to know that in times like these, action could not wait for clarity. They spoke urgently, describing sightings of soldiers, the possibility of a patrol moving through the region, and instructions for discreet observation. Jean-Marc was tasked with keeping watch along a stretch of road leading into the village, recording the movements of anyone who passed. It was a small role, and yet, as he listened to their instructions and took the map into his hands, he felt the weight of responsibility settle firmly on his shoulders. The first night on watch was unlike anything he had imagined. He crouched behind a thicket, eyes straining in the half-light, ears attuned to the slightest rustle in the leaves or distant footfall. Hours passed in a tense rhythm of waiting and imagining. Every shadow seemed alive with threat, every sound amplified. At one point, he thought he saw a silhouette moving against the dim outline of the horizon, only to discover it was a stray dog, moving cautiously along a familiar path. The relief was immediate yet fleeting. He knew the real danger would not be so easily dismissed. Over the following days, Jean-Marc's observations began to uncover a pattern. He noted vehicles traveling at unusual times, a man on horseback whose face he did not recognize, and whispers of gatherings in nearby fields under cover of night. Lucille joined him on occasion, helping to note details, her sharp eyes catching nuances he might have missed. The shape of a shadow, the scent of smoke carried on the wind, the barely audible click of hooves on cobblestones. Together, they began piecing together fragments of a puzzle whose edges seemed impossible to define. It was during one of these nights that Jean-Marc first encountered the profound tension of moral choice in wartime. A soldier, young and clearly anxious, had become separated from his unit and stumbled near the village perimeter. Jean-Marc saw him from the shadows, unsure whether to reveal himself, to help, or to remain hidden. His heart pounded as he weighed the possible outcomes. The soldier's uniform was unfamiliar, and yet there was no immediate threat, but there could be consequences beyond his understanding. For a long minute, Jean-Marc froze, measuring courage against caution, before finally making a decision that would haunt him in subtle ways for years to come. He guided the man quietly to a concealed barn, offering water and warmth, and promised that he would remain hidden until morning. The soldier's grateful yet fearful eyes lingered on Jean-Marc's face, a silent acknowledgement that this single act might ripple far beyond the immediate moment. Word of the encounter spread cautiously through the village. Some praised the discretion and bravery, others warned of the risks, the inevitable attention it might draw. Jean-Marc, meanwhile, wrestled with a new awareness, that ordinary acts could carry extraordinary consequences in times of war. Lucille's presence, her quiet encouragement and shared sense of responsibility, became an anchor for him in this world where decisions were fraught and the consequences uncertain. In the meantime, the village continued its subtle preparations. Barns were reinforced, families established signals for safety, and routes through the surrounding forests were memorized as potential escape paths. Children, unaware of the full scope, still played in the corners of streets and courtyards, their laughter a fragile, almost rebellious assertion of life. Jean-Marc found himself alternating between the tension of night watches and the fleeting peace of daytime routines. Each day was a careful dance between visibility and concealment, action and observation. Then came the first direct threat. A patrol passed through the village at dawn, moving with a disciplined silence that belied the danger it represented. Jean-Marc watched from a concealed vantage point, heart pounding, noting every movement. The soldiers paused at the edge of a field, scanning for signs of life. A farmer emerged, offering routine gestures and explanations, yet the air thrummed with tension. Jean-Marc realized that even the most ordinary interactions had become performances, fraught with risk and requiring constant vigilance. Every gesture, every word, every glance carried significance. That evening, as the village settled into a wary quiet, Jean-Marc walked the familiar paths once more, thinking of the invisible threads that connected each event. Rumors of resistance, of betrayal, of soldiers moving unseen through forests and fields, now felt almost like a living entity, an undercurrent that shifted with every footstep. He thought of the soldier he had helped, of Lucille, of his family, and of the countless others whose lives were quietly entwined in the unfolding drama. Life continued, but with a sharp edge, a heightened awareness of fragility and courage interwoven. And yet, in the midst of this uncertainty, there were moments of almost surreal clarity. The first frost glimmered on the wheat stalks, the river mirrored the muted skies, and the smell of freshly baked bread reminded Jean-Marc that ordinary life, though strained, persisted. These small details became a quiet rebellion against the encroaching shadow of war, a subtle insistence that human experience could endure, adapt, and even find moments of beauty amid chaos. By the time the first leaves fell, Jean-Marc had begun to understand a deeper rhythm to life under occupation and threat. Courage was measured not only in heroics but in observation, patience, and quiet intervention. Every choice, where to walk, what to say, who to trust, was a thread in a delicate, intricate tapestry, a story whose pattern was being written moment by moment. And as the village slept under the watchful stars, he could feel the pulse of history moving, slow and inexorable, weaving ordinary lives into its expansive, unpredictable narrative. Winter approached slowly, creeping along the edges of the village with a chill that seeped into bones and spirits alike. The frost lingered longer each morning, coating the rooftops and fields in a crystalline hush. Jean-Marc noticed that even the animals moved differently now, cautious, hushed, almost aware of the invisible tension that gripped the village. He could sense it in the pauses of conversation at the bakery, in the deliberate steps of neighbors walking along narrow streets, and in the way the river's flow seemed quieter, more watchful, reflecting the cold gray skies above. It was during one of these cold mornings that Jean-Marc first heard about the organized resistance. A stranger had arrived at the edge of the village, cloaked in shadows and secrecy, bringing news that stirred curiosity and fear in equal measure. The man spoke in low tones to the council, revealing glimpses of small cells working to disrupt German movements and to gather intelligence. He mentioned safe houses hidden in the forests, coded messages exchanged under the guise of ordinary life, and individuals whose bravery often went unnoticed. The details were fragmented, deliberately vague, and yet, for Jean-Marc, each word struck like a bell, signaling both opportunity and risk. Jean-Marc found himself drawn into this network, first through observation, then through minor tasks, delivering messages, noting movements along the roads, carrying small packages under the cover of night. Each assignment, though seemingly minor, carried the weight of consequence. One mistake could expose him, the village, and countless others to danger. The thrill of participation mingled with fear, forming a strange duality that became his constant companion. He began to understand, in an almost visceral way, how ordinary lives could be caught in extraordinary circumstances, and how courage often appeared in small, almost invisible gestures. Lucille became more than a companion in these tasks. She became a partner in the quiet resistance. Her sharp eyes and keen memory were invaluable. She noticed patterns Jean-Marc might overlook, the placement of sentries, the timing of patrols, the fleeting interactions of strangers on the roads. Together, they devised subtle ways to convey information without drawing attention, using everyday routines as camouflage. A loaf of bread delivered to a neighbor could carry a note. A misdirected glance at the market could signal a path safe to traverse. In this delicate dance, they began to see the war not as a distant, abstract force, but as a tangible, pervasive presence shaping every choice, every movement. Yet danger was never far away. One night, as Jean-Marc was making his way through a snow-dusted forest path, he heard voices approaching. A patrol, moving with deliberate caution, their boots crunching through the frost. He froze, heart hammering, recalling all the instructions, signals, and precautions. Every step forward could reveal him. Every shadow held the possibility of exposure. He pressed against a tree, holding his breath as the soldiers passed mere feet from where he crouched, their lanterns swinging, illuminating patches of snow and revealing glimpses of the path he had to traverse. When they finally moved on, the tension released in a shuddering sigh, leaving him both exhilarated and shaken. Rumors continued to swirl in the village, some true, some exaggerated, and others entirely fabricated. People spoke of spies infiltrating schools, strangers observing from windows, and entire families disappearing in the night. Jean-Marc learned to weigh each rumor, to discern the grain of truth beneath the embellishment. Some whispers hinted at betrayal, neighbors who might report suspicious behavior to occupying forces, or who might be coerced into revealing details under duress. The social fabric of the village was tested in subtle ways. Trust became currency, and caution was a form of survival. At home, Jean-Marc struggled with his own conscience. He worried for his family, for Lucille, for the village. Every act of defiance or participation in resistance brought both pride and fear. He understood that heroism was often invisible, expressed not in grand gestures but in choices made in shadows, in moments of silence, in deliberate attention to detail. Henri, his father, noticed the tension in his son's eyes and spoke little, offering advice in brief, measured phrases, reminding Jean-Marc that endurance often mattered more than immediate action, and that survival could be its own quiet form of courage. As winter deepened, small victories emerged alongside danger. Messages were delivered successfully, patrols avoided, and intelligence gathered provided glimpses into the movements beyond the village. Yet each success came with the knowledge that the risk was ever present. The line between ordinary life and extraordinary danger blurred further. A simple errand, fetching milk from the dairy, visiting a neighbor, could carry hidden significance, and Jean-Marc began to navigate the village with a heightened awareness, noticing the subtle shifts in posture, tone, and expression of everyone he encountered. In the evenings, when the work of observation and resistance was paused, Jean-Marc and Lucille would sit by the fire, sharing small stories, observing the flickering shadows, and imagining the world beyond the village. These moments of quiet reflection were rare but essential, a reminder that human life persisted in its ordinary forms even under the weight of extraordinary circumstances. They spoke in whispers of what might come, of the distant promise of liberation, and of the resilience required to endure the uncertainty that defined each day. And then, one night, the war touched the village more directly than ever before. A nearby house was raided by soldiers, the occupants taken, the air filled with the cries and confusion of neighbors witnessing the event from a distance. Jean-Marc felt a cold fear settle in his chest, realizing that theoretical danger had transformed into immediate, tangible peril. The village's sense of invulnerability was shattered, replaced by a cautious, measured vigilance. Every decision now carried a weight, every action a potential consequence that could echo far beyond the immediate moment. Yet, amidst this fear, there remained a strange resilience. People continued to bake bread, tend the fields, and maintain the small rituals that marked ordinary life. Children still played, their laughter a defiant claim to normalcy. And Jean-Marc, though burdened with responsibility and anxiety, understood that survival and resistance were not mutually exclusive. They were intertwined, each sustaining the other. Courage, he realized, was not only found in confrontation but in the persistence of life, in the careful, deliberate acts that kept hope alive, and in the quiet determination to navigate a world transformed by conflict. And so, as another long winter night settled over the village, Jean-Marc remained awake a little longer, thinking, imagining, and preparing. The threads of history wove themselves inexorably into the fabric of daily life, connecting past, present, and future. Every choice mattered. Every moment carried significance. And in the hush of snow and shadow, life continued, delicate, precarious, yet undeniably persistent. The first snow settled heavily, blanketing the village in a quiet, deceptive serenity. Streets and fields disappeared under a thick layer of white, softening the harsh outlines of everyday life, and yet the snow carried with it a cruel clarity. Every footprint, every movement, was visible, betraying intentions and presence to anyone who cared to watch. Jean-Marc noticed this immediately. The village seemed quieter, more subdued, as though holding its breath beneath the winter sky. It was during this stillness that the first true shock arrived. Word spread quickly, though cautiously, that one of the families living at the edge of the village had been discovered harboring resistance contacts. Soldiers came in the dead of night. Doors were broken down, voices shouted, and in the morning, a house stood empty, smoke rising from a stove still warm with the remnants of breakfast. Neighbors whispered in corners, some offering sympathy, others speaking of risk, suspicion, and betrayal. Jean-Marc felt a cold weight press into his chest, a grim reminder that war did not distinguish between bravery and misfortune. Lucille and he had been working to gather information on German movements, delivering notes concealed in seemingly mundane packages. Now the stakes were painfully clear. Every action, no matter how careful, carried the risk of drawing attention and potentially destruction. They realized that subtle errors could unravel months of cautious planning, and the responsibility pressed down like frost on exposed skin. Jean-Marc began questioning the boundaries of courage. Where did duty end and recklessness begin? What did it mean to survive while others suffered? Amid these uncertainties, rumors began circulating with increasing intensity. Some claimed that a member of the council had been seen talking to soldiers late at night, exchanging hushed words behind closed doors. Others suggested that strangers passing through the village might be spies, carefully testing loyalty and gathering intelligence. Jean-Marc, previously guided by instinct and observation, now had to weigh each rumor with the sharp precision of someone navigating a minefield. Every decision, every movement became a calculated risk. One evening, while making a routine delivery through a snow-dusted field, Jean-Marc noticed a figure crouched near a fence. It was subtle, deliberate, and immediately alarming. He paused, heart hammering, studying the silhouette. Lucille's voice, quiet and steady, whispered in his mind the careful rules of concealment and caution. He watched as the figure moved with measured steps, a notebook in hand, pausing to sketch, note, or observe something he could not discern. The presence of this unknown observer injected a new, tangible layer of danger into the village. Was this a scout, a spy, or someone simply displaced by the chaos surrounding them? The uncertainty was exhausting, yet impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, the village itself became a living theater of tension and subtle acts of bravery. Every interaction carried weight. Children delivered messages disguised as errands. Neighbors signaled each other with small gestures, and ordinary tasks became opportunities to communicate information without arousing suspicion. Jean-Marc and Lucille found themselves increasingly central to these operations, balancing the need for secrecy with the quiet hope of influencing events. Each success brought cautious relief. Each misstep threatened to undo weeks of careful planning. One particularly cold night, Jean-Marc found himself hiding in the barn of a family long trusted, observing a patrol moving down the main road. Lanterns swung in slow arcs, casting light on patches of snow that sparkled like frost-laden glass. He noted every step, every pause, every glance, and once the patrol moved past, he and Lucille quietly recorded the details. It was meticulous work, demanding full attention and a steady heart. In these moments, Jean-Marc began to understand the paradox of war. It magnified both fear and skill, demanding ordinary people perform acts that could determine life or death. Yet, even as these dangers mounted, life maintained its fragile rhythms. Villagers continued to plant, bake, and repair, finding solace in continuity. The children's laughter, though subdued, persisted in courtyards, a quiet rebellion against the shadow pressing in from beyond the borders. Jean-Marc noticed these small resistances, these glimpses of humanity, and recognized them as an essential part of survival. Courage was not only in confrontation. It was in persistence, in maintaining the fabric of life even under the weight of extraordinary threat. But the consequences of action began to crystallize in ways unavoidable. A neighbor, rumored to be a collaborator, suddenly disappeared, leaving only a note suggesting fear of retribution or exposure. Jean-Marc realized, with a deep unease, that the war was creating fractures not only between nations but within the very heart of his village. Trust became a precious, scarce commodity, and every choice had the potential to redefine relationships permanently. The village was no longer a safe haven. It was a network of shadows, whispers, and fragile alliances, all teetering on the edge of visibility and exposure. As the snow deepened, Jean-Marc spent long hours walking the perimeter of the village, observing, listening, and reflecting. He thought of the family that had been taken, of the unknown observer in the fields, of the missing neighbor, and of Lucille, whose presence reminded him of continuity, warmth, and shared courage. Each day felt like threading a needle between fear and hope, every step a negotiation with the invisible forces of history. And yet, amidst the frost, the whispers, and the looming threat, moments of unexpected clarity emerged. The moonlight on the snow revealed patterns of tracks, human, animal, and mechanical, that spoke more clearly than words. Small acts of kindness and careful observation, unnoticed by most, shaped the village's response to danger. Jean-Marc realized that survival, resilience, and subtle defiance were often inseparable, entwined in the quiet choices of ordinary people acting in extraordinary circumstances. By the end of that bitter week, the village had settled into a tense rhythm. Observation, quiet action, reflection. Jean-Marc and Lucille had become more than participants. They were nodes in a network of vigilance, trust, and courage. The frost-covered world around them seemed simultaneously beautiful and perilous, a reminder that life, even under siege, could be both fragile and enduring. And as they prepared for another long, uncertain night, Jean-Marc understood that the war's shadow had reached not only the village's streets but its very heart, demanding courage, patience, and a steady mind in equal measure. The snow had thickened into a steady white blanket, muffling sounds and creating a deceptive sense of quiet. Yet the village knew better. Every step outside carried risk, every gesture could be misinterpreted, every shadow might conceal danger. Jean-Marc felt the weight of this knowledge pressing down, a constant hum of anxiety intertwined with the daily routines that had become exercises in survival. It began subtly with the disappearance of livestock from several farms. Horses and chickens vanished overnight, leaving the villagers anxious and whispering. Some said it was the work of foraging soldiers. Others feared local collaborators or thieves exploiting the chaos. Jean-Marc, whose responsibilities now included observation and reporting, patrolled the fields with a heightened sense of alert. The empty barns and footprints in the snow hinted at movements that were deliberate, careful, and almost invisible, as though someone was testing the village, watching its responses, and mapping its vulnerabilities. One evening, while delivering a note concealed in a basket of vegetables, Jean-Marc noticed a figure moving against the darkened edge of a forest. The figure paused, scanning the road, then ducked behind a tree as if aware of his presence. Jean-Marc froze, understanding that the village was no longer merely a backdrop for rumors and observation. It was an active theater of intelligence, espionage, and danger. He and Lucille huddled behind the same hedgerow moments later, exchanging quiet instructions and reconsidering their next steps. The thrill of participation had transformed into a steady pulse of anxiety. The war was now tangible, close, and personal. Then came the first real confrontation. A patrol moved through the village one frosty morning, boots crunching over frozen earth. Jean-Marc and Lucille observed from a concealed position, hearts hammering. The soldiers paused near the bakery, questioning the baker and a few villagers who had ventured out. Every question was a test, every glance a measure of suspicion. Jean-Marc's stomach knotted as he watched one of the soldiers step closer to the hedge where they were hidden, nearly catching sight of their shadows. Lucille's hand squeezed his, a silent signal to remain still. The patrol eventually moved on, leaving a trail of tension in their wake. But the encounter left a lingering fear. They realized the margin for error had narrowed to almost nothing. In the days following, the village experienced the consequences of risk. A neighbor, suspected of collaboration, was confronted and publicly warned by other villagers. The social balance shifted subtly, trust fractured, and quiet alliances solidified. Jean-Marc found himself walking a delicate line, observing, assisting, and intervening without drawing attention. Every choice carried weight, and the psychological toll grew heavier with each passing day. The frost in the air seemed to seep into his mind as well, chilling thoughts and sharpening fears. Lucille, despite her calm demeanor, showed signs of strain. Nights spent hiding messages, avoiding patrols, and coordinating information had taken their toll. Jean-Marc noticed the subtle tremors in her hands, the lingering looks of anxiety when the wind carried sounds from distant roads, and the careful measurement of every step she took outside. He realized that courage was not a single act, but an accumulation of endurance, vigilance, and calculated risk. Their partnership had become a lifeline, yet both understood that it was fragile, as delicate as the thin ice over the river. Rumors swirled faster now, spreading like sparks in dry hay. Whispers of betrayals, sightings of strange uniforms, and reports of sudden disappearances kept the villagers on edge. Jean-Marc listened carefully, parsing the fragments of truth from exaggeration. Each day, the invisible tension grew heavier, compressing ordinary routines into high-stakes exercises in caution. Even the simple act of walking to the bakery or the river became fraught with potential danger. The ordinary world of childhood streets, familiar fields, and quiet courtyards had transformed into a landscape of constant vigilance. Then, a direct consequence struck. One of the families whose home had been used as a temporary safe house for resistance contacts was discovered. Soldiers arrived silently, capturing the occupants and leaving a scene of fear and confusion. Jean-Marc and Lucille, having helped coordinate the safe movement of information and people, understood the implicit warning. Every action had consequences. The reality of war was no longer abstract. It was immediate, personal, and potentially catastrophic. In the aftermath, the village held its breath. Conversations became whispers, movements measured, and vigilance sharpened. Jean-Marc took to walking the perimeter at night, noting every footprint, listening for every sound, and refining the network of signals that had been established. Lucille assisted, her eyes scanning the darkened landscape, her mind calculating routes and observing patterns that might otherwise go unnoticed. The responsibility was immense, and yet both felt the subtle pull of duty, a compulsion to maintain life, resistance, and hope. Amid this, Jean-Marc noticed small acts of quiet defiance. A child leaving a note in a hidden spot for a neighbor, a baker distributing bread in plain sight but with secret instructions, and elders maintaining the rituals of daily life despite the threat of scrutiny. These acts, fragile and seemingly insignificant, became symbols of resilience. Jean-Marc began to understand that the war's shadow was not absolute. Life, even in its smallest forms, persisted. Courage was measured not only by confrontation, but by endurance, ingenuity, and the quiet insistence to continue living fully, even under threat. And so, as the snow deepened, as patrols passed, and as whispers of danger filled the air, Jean-Marc remained vigilant. The village, fragile and tense, continued to breathe, to resist, and to endure. Each night, as he and Lucille paused to rest, the frost-covered streets reflected both peril and the persistent hope that ordinary life, though threatened, could find ways to survive. History, in its slow, inexorable rhythm, moved through them, shaping decisions, forging courage, and demanding resilience. Winter pressed harder against the village now, biting and unrelenting, with the wind whipping across empty streets and frozen fields. The snow, which had once seemed a softening blanket, now became a brittle, unyielding witness to every movement, every whispered conversation. Jean-Marc had grown accustomed to this frozen vigilance, yet each day brought new challenges, new uncertainties that reminded him how fragile life had become. It began with the arrival of outsiders, figures cloaked in darkness, traveling silently through the woods surrounding the village. They were not the familiar soldiers or patrolling scouts. These were members of a larger resistance network, moving cautiously, carrying information, supplies, and messages. Jean-Marc and Lucille observed them from the shadows, understanding immediately that the stakes had risen. The presence of these strangers meant the village was no longer isolated. It had become part of a larger web of activity, a node in a network of covert operations stretching far beyond the snow-covered fields. Jean-Marc was introduced to a man named René, a quiet, wiry figure with sharp eyes and a voice that carried both authority and calm. René spoke in careful tones, explaining the broader structure of the resistance and the importance of the village as a point of observation, communication, and subtle action. He outlined tasks that required precision, discretion, and courage. Jean-Marc felt the weight of responsibility settle more heavily than ever. It was no longer just about observation. It was about participation in something larger, something that could change the course of many lives, yet carried immense risk. The first large-scale test came sooner than expected. Soldiers, more numerous and better organized than the previous patrols, moved through the outer areas of the village. Their objective was unclear, but their methodical approach suggested serious intent. Jean-Marc and Lucille, guided by René's advice, took positions along hidden paths, tracking the patrol's movements, noting every change in formation, and preparing contingencies in case the village was discovered. The tension was nearly unbearable. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the crunch of boots across frozen ground, each sound amplified in Jean-Marc's mind. During the encounter, Jean-Marc observed a neighbor, someone he had trusted, acting suspiciously. Glancing toward the patrol, stepping aside, whispering to a figure Jean-Marc could not fully see. Panic flared briefly, and the question of betrayal, whether real or imagined, pressed down with immediate weight. Could the neighbor be working with the soldiers, or were they merely taking precautions? The ambiguity was maddening. Jean-Marc realized, painfully, that in times of war, perception alone could shape danger as much as reality. After the patrol passed, leaving a trail of fear and speculation, Jean-Marc, Lucille, and René convened in a hidden barn. Maps were spread across rough wooden surfaces, details were compared, and plans adjusted. The psychological pressure was intense. Each decision had consequences, each miscalculation a potential disaster. Yet, even in this tension, there was clarity. The village could no longer afford to act cautiously or reactively. They needed foresight, cooperation, and courage. Jean-Marc felt both pride and fear, a mixture that became a defining pulse of his daily existence. Rumors, as always, surged in tandem with these events. Whispers of collaborators, of spies in the village, of patrols diverted by careful observation, and of strangers moving through nearby towns created a constant undercurrent of anxiety. Jean-Marc learned to sift truth from fiction, understanding that both could shape behavior, morale, and decisions in equal measure. The village itself had become a living organism, responsive to external pressure, yet fragile under the strain. Every resident played a role, whether active or passive, in sustaining the balance between survival and exposure. One evening, René revealed a subtle but important task. A message had to be delivered to a neighboring village, one that could alter supply routes and provide crucial intelligence. Jean-Marc volunteered, understanding the risks. Lucille, worried but resolute, prepared him for the journey, offering advice, routes, and contingency plans. The task was simple in description but perilous in execution. Snow-covered paths, unfamiliar patrols, and the constant threat of discovery made each step a negotiation with danger itself. Jean-Marc felt the mixture of fear, responsibility, and resolve that had become his constant companion. The night of the delivery, Jean-Marc moved cautiously through forests and fields, the snow muffling his steps but revealing every subtle movement in pale moonlight. Shadows shifted, distant noises hinted at unseen presence, and each choice of path carried the potential for disaster. Along the way, he encountered a small group of resistance members, traveling in the opposite direction. Their silent nods communicated recognition, trust, and shared purpose without words. It was a rare moment of solidarity amid a landscape dominated by fear and uncertainty. Returning to the village, Jean-Marc noticed subtle changes. Shutters slightly ajar, footprints that did not belong, and signs of hurried preparation in homes along the streets. The war's influence had deepened, leaving marks not only on the physical landscape, but on the mental and emotional state of every resident. Lucille met him at the edge of the village, relief and tension mingling in her expression. They shared the details of their observations, piecing together a picture that was partial, fragile, yet essential. Amid these events, life persisted in small but meaningful ways. The baker continued his work, children still ran in the courtyards, and neighbors exchanged cautious greetings. These ordinary acts, carried out under extraordinary circumstances, became symbols of defiance and resilience. Jean-Marc realized that the war was not only a series of external threats but a test of inner endurance. The ability to maintain humanity, awareness, and hope in a world that seemed intent on eroding both. By the end of the week, the village had settled into a tense rhythm once more. Observation, action, and reflection, punctuated by moments of quiet humanity. Jean-Marc understood that each day would bring new challenges, that every shadow might conceal danger, and that the balance between courage and caution was delicate and essential. The snow-covered streets, silent forests, and frozen fields were more than landscapes. They were mirrors of human experience under pressure, reflecting both fear and resilience, despair and hope, fragility and determination. The snow had begun to melt in places, revealing the uneven, worn paths that crisscrossed the village. Yet the apparent softening of the landscape offered little comfort. Danger had not receded. It had merely shifted, finding new ways to weave itself into the rhythm of daily life. Jean-Marc moved carefully, noting the subtle changes in the village. Shuttered windows, hurried movements behind curtains, and the lingering traces of fear that clung to every conversation and gesture. It started with the quiet disappearance of a family living near the edge of the forest. They had been helpful in small ways, providing temporary shelter, delivering information, and occasionally guiding travelers safely through the woods. One morning, their house was empty. Smoke still curled from the chimney, the door was ajar, and footprints in the snow led only so far before vanishing. Neighbors whispered of soldiers, collaborators, or some unknown fate that had befallen them. Jean-Marc felt a cold knot of dread tighten in his chest. It was the first time the war had touched the village in a way that was unambiguous, irrevocable, and terrifyingly real. Lucille and Jean-Marc convened immediately with René, who had been coordinating with the wider resistance network. "We can't afford mistakes," René said quietly, his eyes scanning maps and notes as though trying to anticipate every possible outcome. Every action, every observation, now more than ever, carries consequences. Jean-Marc understood this fully. The disappearance of the family was not just a warning. It was a lesson in the delicate balance between courage and exposure. The following nights were tense beyond measure. Patrols became more frequent, moving with greater precision and intent. Jean-Marc and Lucille took to patrolling hidden paths, observing movements in the surrounding woods, and refining their network of signals. Each encounter required absolute stillness, attention, and the ability to react instantaneously to unexpected developments. Even minor sounds, crunching snow, snapping twigs, distant voices, could no longer be ignored. Every noise carried potential meaning, every shadow implied threat. Amid this constant vigilance, rumors of betrayal began to circulate more aggressively. Whispers of neighbors colluding with soldiers, of spies observing the village from the hills, and of previously trusted friends disappearing at night infiltrated every discussion. Jean-Marc found himself questioning the motives of people he had once assumed he could rely upon. The uncertainty gnawed at him, a persistent reminder that perception could be as dangerous as reality. Lucille, too, felt the tension, and together they navigated the growing web of suspicion, striving to distinguish truth from fear. One night, while observing a distant patrol, Jean-Marc noticed an unusual pattern. A soldier lingered near the outer fields, scanning seemingly without reason. Lucille spotted subtle movements of his companions. Small signals, a faint exchange of papers, gestures that were almost imperceptible. It became clear that the village was now a target of specific interest, not just a casual checkpoint. Jean-Marc realized the stakes had escalated. They were no longer observers of a passing threat, They were participants in a dangerous tableau where visibility could mean capture, and a misstep could mean death. The following morning brought grim news. A neighbor, a man known for cautious intelligence gathering, had been taken during the night. Soldiers left the house in disarray, searching for evidence, leaving the community shaken. Jean-Marc felt a sharp mix of fear and resolve. Fear for those still at risk, and resolve to act more strategically, more cautiously, and more purposefully. Every small victory, every avoided detection, now carried the weight of lives already lost and the knowledge that any misjudgment could replicate that loss. Amid the escalating threat, the village sought ways to maintain its fragile rhythm. Children still played, though under stricter supervision. Meals were prepared, bread baked, and essential work continued, but always with a watchful eye on the streets and fields beyond. The ordinary tasks of life had become exercises in vigilance, subtlety, and patience. Jean-Marc understood that the persistence of life itself had become a form of resistance, a quiet defiance against forces that sought to disrupt every routine, every connection, every sense of security. Lucille, ever alert, helped organize hidden caches of supplies and messages. She guided children along safe paths, taught subtle signals to communicate without words, and reinforced the protocols that could preserve lives. Jean-Marc, observing and participating, began to internalize the complexity of the village's survival. Courage, vigilance, and careful calculation were inseparable, intertwined in ways that demanded constant awareness and judgment. By the week's end, Jean-Marc noticed subtle changes in himself and the villagers. Eyes were sharper, movements more deliberate, conversations more cautious. Even laughter felt tempered, measured, aware of what could be lost in an instant. The village had become a microcosm of the larger conflict, an intricate network of observation, action, and consequence, where every decision, no matter how small, carried weight. Jean-Marc understood that survival required not only courage but constant adaptation, a capacity to navigate shifting threats, and the ability to balance fear with the unyielding need to continue living, observing, and resisting. As night fell, heavy clouds masking the moon, Jean-Marc and Lucille huddled near a fire, exchanging observations and mapping the next phase of their careful operations. The shadows outside seemed thicker, more purposeful, carrying the tension of soldiers, spies, and the uncertainty of unseen eyes. And yet, in the warmth of shared vigilance, they found brief reassurance. Life persisted, fragile but enduring, and each act of awareness, caution, and defiance added a thread to the tapestry of resilience that held the village together against the encroaching storm. The frost had hardened overnight, making every movement deliberate and every sound exaggerated in the stillness. Jean-Marc felt the weight of the cold pressing through his coat, but it was not the chill of winter that most burdened him. It was the ever-present tension, the knowledge that every choice, every glance, every footstep could have consequences that rippled far beyond the village. A new message arrived from Renee, carried under the cover of darkness by a traveler whose presence was almost ghost-like. The message was simple but heavy with implication. The resistance needed more than observation, they needed action. Certain patrol routes had to be diverted, information had to be delivered to multiple neighboring villages, and small but decisive acts had to be carried out to weaken the enemy's grip. Jean-Marc felt a mixture of anticipation and fear. The tasks were no longer exercises in caution, but moves on a board where a single misstep could cost lives. That night, Jean-Marc and Lucille set out into the snow-dusted landscape. Every step was measured, every sound carefully noted. The villagers' houses were quiet, shadows long and muted. They navigated through narrow alleys and forested paths, delivering messages and observing patterns that had been previously unnoticed. Along the way, Jean-Marc noticed subtle signs of previous activity: disturbed snow, footprints leading to hidden entrances, and faint marks on trees indicating safe paths or danger zones. Each observation was a piece of a larger puzzle, and the awareness that their actions were part of a broader strategy heightened both excitement and tension. However, the first consequence struck almost immediately. A patrol, moving faster and more unpredictably than before, intercepted a route they had intended to use. Jean-Marc and Lucille froze behind a thicket, hearts pounding, every instinct alert. The patrol lingered, searching the area, eyes sweeping methodically. Lucille pressed close, whispering instructions and reminders about remaining still. Jean-Marc could feel the icy weight of fear pressing on his chest. Minutes stretched, elongated by every sound. The crunch of distant boots, the whisper of wind through branches, the faint rustle of animals in the underbrush. Then, as abruptly as it had appeared, the patrol moved on, leaving a residue of adrenaline, relief, and unease. By dawn, the consequences became visible in the village. A barn previously used as a temporary storage point had been destroyed by soldiers, a clear warning of the risks of resistance activity. The neighbors spoke in hushed tones of those taken, of those missing, and of what might yet be discovered. Jean-Marc understood the fragility of their position. Every act of courage now carried the tangible risk of irreversible loss. The invisible thread connecting action and consequence had been pulled taut, and any misstep could snap it entirely. Despite the mounting tension, life persisted in small, crucial ways. Children still carried hidden messages under the guise of play. Neighbors exchanged signals disguised as casual gestures, and villagers continued the routines of bread-making, repairs, and care for the animals. Each act, ordinary in appearance, was a deliberate assertion of life and defiance, a subtle rebellion against the encroaching shadow. Jean-Marc and Lucille relied on these acts as both camouflage and reassurance, a reminder that even amidst danger, human resilience persisted. The psychological toll on both of them became increasingly apparent. Lucille, though composed outwardly, occasionally displayed signs of strain. A tremor in her hands, a distant look, or a pause that seemed to last longer than necessary. Jean-Marc noticed these details, feeling the pressure of responsibility not only for his own actions but for hers as well. He understood that leadership in these circumstances was not a matter of commanding movements, but of sustaining morale, observing human limits, and balancing caution with necessary risk. A new layer of complication arrived in the form of misinformation. Rumors of collaborators, spies, and hidden observers reached Jean-Marc and Lucille from multiple sources. Some were deliberate deceptions, others were genuine but misinterpreted observations. Sorting truth from falsehood became an essential skill, one that demanded patience, discernment, and constant vigilance. Every choice required weighing not only potential physical risk but the potential for misjudgment, and the knowledge that perception itself could be weaponized. By midweek, Jean-Marc and Lucille were engaged in increasingly complex operations, coordinating movements with distant resistance cells, mapping patrols, and directing supplies while avoiding detection. Each task reinforced the fragile web of human connections, courage, and observation that held the village together. Their awareness of mortality and consequence sharpened, transforming simple actions, such as leaving a note, guiding a neighbor, or choosing a route, into moments of quiet heroism. And yet, amidst the danger and tension, there were glimpses of hope. Snow-covered fields shimmered under the pale moonlight, children's laughter occasionally broke the hush, and the village, fragile but persistent, maintained its routines. Jean-Marc recognized that resilience was not solely the absence of fear but the presence of determination. The ability to act, observe, and endure despite the shadow pressing on every corner of life. As night fell again, heavy with clouds and anticipation, Jean-Marc and Lucille huddled together, mapping the next moves, reviewing lessons learned, and preparing for the dangers that would inevitably follow. The village slept uneasily, caught between survival and exposure, between courage and caution. Jean-Marc understood that the threads of history, danger, and human resilience were intertwined in ways that demanded constant attention, awareness, and perseverance. And in that quiet moment, he realized that each act, each decision, no matter how small, carried the weight of countless lives, hopes, and fears, forming a tapestry of courage and endurance under the most extraordinary pressure. The village, usually quiet beneath its layers of frost and snow, now pulsed with tension that could be felt in every step along its streets. Jean-Marc moved carefully, aware that even the most ordinary actions, fetching water, walking along the main road, checking traps, could be watched, interpreted, and punished. The events of recent weeks had transformed the village from a fragile sanctuary into a stage of calculated observation, strategy, and risk. It began with a scream, piercing the early morning stillness. One of the families living near the forest's edge had been discovered in the night. Soldiers moved swiftly, and by the time the villagers gathered at a safe distance, the house was empty except for scattered belongings. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed the family had been taken as prisoners, others whispered of executions. Jean-Marc felt a cold weight descend upon him, a mixture of grief, fear, and responsibility. He realized that danger was no longer abstract. It was immediate, cruel, and deeply personal. Lucille, usually composed and precise, showed signs of strain that Jean-Marc could no longer ignore. Her hands shook slightly as she handled messages. Her gaze lingered too long on distant patrols. Her voice carried an edge of tension even in quiet conversation. Jean-Marc understood that the burden was shared. Not only were they responsible for their own safety, but the lives of neighbors, children, and those who trusted them now rested heavily on their vigilance. The psychological weight of this awareness pressed upon both of them relentlessly. A new complication arose when a neighbor, long considered trustworthy, began acting strangely. He appeared overly curious, asked probing questions, and lingered near patrol routes in a manner that suggested more than casual concern. Jean-Marc and Lucille exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that suspicion could fracture even the closest relationships. They began to operate with a new caution, relying on subtle signals and silent observation, unsure whether the neighbor was motivated by fear, loyalty to the occupiers, or some other hidden agenda. That same week, a patrol arrived unexpectedly in the village square. Jean-Marc and Lucille had been monitoring a route near the edge of the woods when they noticed the patrol changing direction, moving faster and more aggressively than before. They pressed against the shadowed edge of a building, hearts pounding, every sense alert. The patrol lingered near houses known to have provided shelter or supplies to resistance members. Jean-Marc felt a sickening realization. The enemy had begun targeting the village based on patterns, intelligence, and suspicion. No longer was it enough to hide. They had to anticipate, strategize, and react with precision. Amidst this danger, losses mounted. Another family was discovered during a supply run. Their home was searched, belongings scattered, and they were taken, leaving the village shaken. Children clung to parents, neighbors whispered in corners, and the sense of normalcy that had persisted in small ways evaporated. Jean-Marc felt both guilt and determination. Every task, every route, every message now carried the burden of protecting those who remained. Renee convened a secret meeting in the barn, gathering Jean-Marc, Lucille, and a few trusted villagers. Maps were spread, movements reviewed, and plans adjusted. The responsibility was immense, coordinating resistance, protecting lives, and maintaining secrecy under constant threat. Jean-Marc understood that even small errors could cascade into disaster. Every choice required precision, every observation could determine survival or loss. Despite the escalating dangers, life continued in fragile ways. Bread was baked, animals fed, and children quietly trained to understand hidden signals. The village maintained rituals of care and endurance, creating pockets of humanity amidst fear. Jean-Marc realized that survival itself had become a form of resistance. The persistence of routine, the maintenance of community, and the quiet assertion that life would continue despite threat. One night, while observing patrols near the forest, Jean-Marc noticed a subtle pattern. The soldiers were coordinating with local informants. Small signals, brief glances, and gestures indicated a web of intelligence that extended beyond the village. The realization was chilling. The enemy was learning, adapting, and probing for weaknesses. Jean-Marc and Lucille adjusted their routes, refined signals, and reinforced contingencies, understanding that vigilance alone was insufficient. They had to outthink the threat constantly. By the end of the week, the village had entered a tense rhythm. Observation, cautious action, reflection. The residents moved with deliberation, trust was measured, and courage became a daily practice rather than an abstract concept. Jean-Marc understood that the threads of history, fear, and resilience were woven tightly, and that their survival depended on skill, vigilance, and the quiet persistence of humanity in the face of relentless danger. And so, as another long winter night fell, heavy clouds obscuring the moon, Jean-Marc and Lucille prepared for the inevitable challenges ahead. The village slept uneasily, shadows stretching across snow-covered streets, each one a reminder that life, hope, and courage were fragile but enduring. Every action mattered, every choice carried weight, and in the hush of darkness, the delicate balance between survival and exposure persisted, shaping the destiny of the village and those who risked everything to protect it. The village had become a place where shadows carried meaning, where every step was calculated, and where the simplest actions could determine life or death. Jean-Marc moved cautiously along the frozen streets, noting subtle changes in snow patterns, footprints, and the slightest movement behind windows. Each day felt like threading a needle between courage and recklessness, every moment a negotiation with uncertainty. The first shock came at dawn. A fire had broken out at a house near the edge of the village. Smoke curled into the pale sky, black against the soft white of the snow. Neighbors rushed to the scene, but soldiers were already present, moving methodically, searching, and taking what they found useful. Jean-Marc recognized the signs immediately. This was a warning, a demonstration of the consequences of resistance activities, and a message to those who dared defy the occupying forces. Lucille clutched his arm as they observed from a hidden path, her eyes wide with fear, her breath clouding in the cold morning air. The fire and soldiers' presence set off a chain of reactions. Families began moving their possessions to safer locations, hiding what could not be carried, and sending messages along hidden routes. The village became a flurry of covert activity, with every movement observed, every gesture weighed for meaning. Jean-Marc and Lucille took on new responsibilities, coordinating routes, monitoring patrols, and ensuring that those who might otherwise be caught unaware were given a chance to evade detection. Moral dilemmas emerged sharply. A neighbor, frightened by the recent events, suggested revealing the location of certain hidden messages to avoid further retribution. Jean-Marc hesitated, knowing that such a disclosure could protect some in the short term but endanger countless others in the network. The decision pressed on him. Self-preservation against collective responsibility, fear against duty, pragmatism against principle. Lucille's quiet insistence on caution and strategic thinking guided him, yet the tension between urgency and ethical responsibility gnawed at both of them. Later that night, Jean-Marc observed a patrol near the barns where supplies had been hidden. Soldiers moved deliberately, yet cautiously, suggesting that they had intelligence regarding the village's covert activities. Jean-Marc signaled to Lucille, and together they managed to redirect attention, guiding the patrol away from critical locations without revealing their presence. The tension of the moment left them shaking, a mixture of adrenaline, relief, and the awareness of just how close they had come to exposure. Amid these dangers, the psychological toll intensified. Lucille's normally steady demeanor showed cracks. Sleeping lightly, waking suddenly to distant noises, scanning shadows as if they were tangible threats. Jean-Marc felt the strain as well. The weight of responsibility for lives, for critical information, and for the delicate balance of survival pressed constantly against him. Every misstep could be fatal, every hesitation potentially deadly. Yet in the midst of this, they continued, driven by necessity, courage, and a shared understanding of the stakes. The village itself adapted. Children became adept at subtle communication, learning signals that could indicate danger without words. Neighbors developed intricate routines to obscure their activities from potential observers. Even the simple act of moving through the village became a carefully choreographed performance, blending normalcy with stealth. Jean-Marc marveled at the resilience that ordinary people could summon when confronted with extraordinary danger. However, losses mounted. A family known to have aided the resistance disappeared during the night, leaving only traces. A blanket left on a doorstep, footprints abruptly ending in the snow, a note suggesting capture or worse. The villagers whispered, debated, and speculated, yet life could not pause. Meals had to be prepared, animals cared for, and essential routines maintained. Each act of survival became an assertion of defiance, a statement that life would continue despite threat, loss, and fear. Jean-Marc and Lucille also faced personal risks. One night, while moving messages through the woods, they were nearly caught by a patrol whose route had been unexpectedly altered. They froze, pressed against a snow-covered tree, listening to the crunch of boots passing within meters. The encounter ended without discovery, but the shock remained, a tangible reminder that danger was omnipresent, unpredictable, and relentless. By the end of the week, the village had settled into a fragile rhythm. Cautious movement, careful observation, and constant reflection. Every shadow, every sound, and every interaction carried significance. Jean-Marc understood that the threads of fear, courage, and resilience were tightly woven, and that survival depended on vigilance, skill, and moral clarity. Life persisted in the village, fragile but persistent, a testament to human endurance under relentless pressure. As Jean-Marc and Lucille prepared for another long night, heavy clouds masking the moon, they reflected on the weeks past, the losses, the risks, the difficult choices, and the moments of quiet defiance. The village slept uneasily, and yet in its fragile heartbeat, hope endured. Every action mattered, every choice carried weight, and each small act of courage wove a thread into the tapestry of survival and resistance that defined the community. The frost had hardened into a brittle shell over the fields, cracking underfoot as Jean-Marc moved through the village streets. The tension in the air was palpable, like the hush before a storm, and every shadow seemed to carry intent. The village, once a fragile sanctuary, now felt like a tightly wound coil, ready to snap with the slightest pressure. Early that morning, news spread quickly. Another family had vanished. This time, there were no traces of struggle, only a quiet emptiness where warmth and life had once existed. Rumors of informants, betrayal, and soldiers acting on intelligence circulated rapidly, creating a pervasive atmosphere of suspicion. Neighbors exchanged cautious glances, measuring every word, every gesture, aware that even the smallest slip could invite scrutiny or punishment. Jean-Marc felt the weight of responsibility grow heavier with each disappearance. The stakes had become alarmingly personal. Lucille moved beside him as they navigated the icy streets, her eyes scanning every window, every darkened doorway. "We can't let fear paralyze us," she whispered, her voice carrying both urgency and resolve. Jean-Marc nodded, understanding the truth in her words, yet feeling the tension coiling tighter in his chest. Each decision now carried the potential to save or endanger lives, and the margin for error had narrowed to near invisibility. Internal conflicts within the village began to emerge. Some residents, gripped by fear, suggested cooperating with soldiers or revealing hidden routes to avoid further losses. Others insisted on maintaining secrecy and continuing resistance activities, arguing that any compromise would only worsen the long-term danger. Heated debates erupted in whispers behind closed doors, fracturing the fragile trust that had previously bound the community. Jean-Marc observed these tensions carefully, realizing that survival depended not only on vigilance against external threats, but also on managing fear, doubt, and division within the village itself. Meanwhile, Jean-Marc and Lucille intensified their operations. They coordinated safe passage for messages and supplies, observed patrol patterns, and refined the network of signals that allowed villagers to communicate without detection. Each task was laden with peril, requiring precision, timing, and an acute awareness of both physical and social landscapes. Jean-Marc understood that a single misstep, a wrong gesture, a misinterpreted signal, could unravel weeks of careful planning and expose countless lives to danger. One particularly tense night, a patrol moved along a previously safe path. Jean-Marc and Lucille observed from a hidden vantage point, noting subtle changes in the soldiers' formations and movements. The patrol lingered, appearing to anticipate patterns they had used successfully for weeks. Jean-Marc realized that the enemy had adapted, using intelligence, observation, and local knowledge to increase their effectiveness. The margin for error had become razor-thin, and the need for vigilance absolute. Losses mounted, and the psychological toll intensified. Another neighbor disappeared, leaving only a small token behind, a sign that even those who had been cautious were not immune. The village moved with measured urgency, preserving routine where possible but constantly adjusting to avoid detection. Children were given new instructions in secret, households rearranged supplies, and escape routes were rehearsed quietly, all under the shadow of fear. Jean-Marc felt the heavy responsibility of ensuring that these measures were both effective and discreet. Amid this escalating danger, moral dilemmas became unavoidable. Should they risk the lives of a few to protect many? Should a hesitant neighbor be coerced into cooperation, or left to their own devices with the potential for betrayal? Jean-Marc and Lucille debated, calculated, and sometimes acted instinctively, guided by intuition honed under months of pressure. Each choice carried weight, shaping not only immediate survival but the village's capacity for continued resistance. Despite the fear and tension, the village displayed resilience. Ordinary acts of life, baking bread, tending animals, sharing small comforts, continued, providing a quiet defiance against the encroaching shadow. Jean-Marc recognized that these acts were more than survival. They were statements of endurance, fragments of humanity that persisted even under relentless threat. By the week's end, the village had adapted to a new reality: constant observation, careful action, and strategic patience. Trust remained fragile, yet it persisted, maintained through shared vigilance and subtle communication. Jean-Marc and Lucille understood that their role had become central not just in operations, but in sustaining morale and cohesion within the community. Survival was no longer a simple matter of avoiding detection. It required courage, insight, and the ability to navigate the psychological complexities of a village under siege. As night fell, blanketing the village in cold silence, Jean-Marc and Lucille prepared for the dangers that lay ahead. Every shadow, every sound, every choice carried consequence. Yet within this tension, life endured, fragile and luminous, a testament to resilience, courage, and the enduring will to survive even when the world outside seemed intent on destruction. The village lay under a heavy, gray sky, the air brittle and sharp with frost. Every sound, from the distant howl of a dog to the faint clatter of shutters, seemed amplified, carrying the potential for danger. Jean-Marc moved deliberately, each step measured against the snow-covered ground, his mind calculating paths, contingencies, and the ever-present risk of exposure. Internal tensions that had simmered beneath the surface now threatened to erupt. Some villagers, frightened by the constant losses and disappearances, began questioning the necessity of continued resistance. "What good is secrecy if we all vanish?" whispered a man near the edge of the square, his fear barely concealed. Others insisted on strict adherence to the network's protocols, arguing that any deviation would invite disaster. The debates, once hushed, now edged closer to confrontation, fracturing trust and complicating coordination. Jean-Marc realized that the greatest danger was not always the soldiers outside the village, but the fear and indecision within it. That afternoon, Jean-Marc and Lucille observed a patrol approaching the village from the northern path, a route that had previously seemed safe. Soldiers moved with unusual precision, signaling that they had gained intelligence about resistance activities. The two huddled behind a snow-laden wall, hearts hammering, calculating the risks of moving versus staying hidden. Lucille whispered, "If they see us now, the consequences will be immediate." Jean-Marc nodded, understanding the deadly precision of this threat. Meanwhile, small betrayals began surfacing. A neighbor, previously trusted, was seen passing subtle signals to soldiers. Whether coerced or willing, the act underscored the fragile nature of trust in a village under siege. Jean-Marc felt the weight of responsibility tighten in his chest. He had to protect lives, maintain secrecy, and guide the village's actions while balancing fear, loyalty, and moral clarity. Every choice was a test, every step a potential pivot between safety and disaster. Amid these external threats and internal fractures, the resistance network required action. Jean-Marc and Lucille were tasked with delivering critical information to a distant safe house, a mission whose success could prevent further losses in the village. The journey required careful navigation through forests and fields, avoiding patrols, informants, and unforeseen hazards. Jean-Marc felt the weight of every life depending on their caution, while the chill of winter gnawed at their resolve. During the mission, Jean-Marc encountered a small group of villagers acting independently, attempting to aid the effort without coordination. While their intentions were honorable, their movements created potential exposure. Jean-Marc intervened quietly, redirecting them along safer paths, his mind racing with calculations of consequence. The incident highlighted the fragile balance between initiative and recklessness, courage and prudence. Returning to the village, Jean-Marc and Lucille discovered another loss. A family who had been providing food and shelter for resistance members had been taken during the night. The emptiness of their home, the hastily abandoned belongings, and the absence of familiar voices cast a heavy pall over the community. Jean-Marc felt a surge of grief, tempered by the knowledge that continued fear and indecision could compound the tragedy. Resilience, he realized, required more than hiding. It required careful, calculated action despite personal loss. That night, meetings were held in hushed tones. Jean-Marc and Lucille, alongside Renee and a few trusted villagers, reviewed patrol movements, adjusted escape routes, and refined communication signals. Moral dilemmas dominated the discussions. Should they reveal certain safe paths to hesitant neighbors, risking exposure, or maintain strict secrecy, potentially endangering those least able to navigate danger? Every decision carried the weight of lives, trust, and the village's future. Amid the darkness, small acts of defiance persisted. Children delivered secret messages, neighbors coordinated subtle routines to mislead potential observers, and ordinary life, feeding animals, tending fires, sharing meals, continued under a veil of fear. Jean-Marc observed these acts, understanding that courage often manifested in persistence, endurance, and the quiet assertion of life in the face of relentless threat. By the end of the week, the village had adapted to this precarious new reality. Constant vigilance, strategic caution, and moral deliberation became daily practice. The threads of survival, courage, and resilience intertwined with the threads of fear, suspicion, and loss, forming a complex tapestry that defined the village's existence. Jean-Marc and Lucille understood that every shadow, every sound, and every choice shaped not only immediate survival, but the enduring character of their community. As night fell once more, blanketing the village in cold silence, Jean-Marc and Lucille prepared for the challenges ahead. Open threats, hidden betrayals, and the unrelenting weight of responsibility pressed upon them. Yet in the quiet, fragile persistence of life, they found a measure of hope. Every act, every decision, carried meaning, weaving together the fragile, luminous fabric of resilience that sustained the village in a world of uncertainty, fear, and loss. The air was sharper now, a biting edge that seemed to cut through the village as if reflecting the tension that had accumulated over weeks. Jean-Marc and Lucille moved with deliberate care, their eyes scanning every roofline, alley, and shadow, aware that danger no longer whispered. It demanded attention, presence, and quick judgment. The village had become a stage where even minor missteps could yield disastrous consequences. That evening, the first direct confrontation occurred. A patrol, moving faster and more aggressively than any before, approached the village square, clearly acting on precise intelligence. Soldiers carried themselves with a lethal purpose, signaling to each other and checking doors and windows with meticulous care. Jean-Marc and Lucille, hiding behind a low wall, could feel the pulse of fear thrum through the frozen air. Every breath, every movement was laden with potential exposure. The patrol entered a home known for harboring supplies for the resistance. Shouts echoed, objects were thrown aside, and the family inside was dragged into the snow. Jean-Marc's stomach knotted as he recognized the unmistakable signs of abduction. He could do nothing in that moment. Any movement, any attempt to intervene, would risk not only his own life but the lives of others still hidden. Lucille's hand gripped his arm tightly, a shared recognition of helplessness and determination. As the patrol left, the village gathered in quiet clusters, whispers spreading faster than snowflakes in a gusting wind. "We must move more carefully," Renee said, his voice steady but heavy. "Our positions, our routes, even our silence, everything is being watched. We adapt or we vanish." Jean-Marc felt the truth in every syllable. The enemy had begun exploiting patterns, observing routines, and taking lives based on precise calculations. Survival now required not only caution but anticipation, strategy, and sometimes ruthless decision-making. In the following days, Jean-Marc and Lucille coordinated increasingly complex maneuvers. They guided neighbors along hidden paths, distributed messages and supplies with meticulous timing, and observed patrol patterns to predict future movements. Every task required constant vigilance, mental calculation, and the ability to weigh risk against necessity. The psychological pressure was immense. Fear, grief, and fatigue interwove, creating a constant, gnawing tension that shadowed every action. Losses continued. Another family was discovered, taken during the night as soldiers swept the village edges. The remaining villagers adjusted routines again, moving with even greater stealth, hiding what could be moved, and rehearsing escape routes silently. The fragility of their survival was palpable. Each act of defiance carried immediate risk. Jean-Marc realized that courage was no longer abstract. It was an essential, practical skill, intertwined with observation, strategy, and endurance. Moral dilemmas intensified. Should they prioritize the safe passage of supplies over the immediate safety of certain villagers? Should hesitant neighbors be forced to comply with plans, risking exposure, or left to act independently, risking their capture? Jean-Marc and Lucille debated quietly, weighing the lives of many against the morality of coercion, the ethics of secrecy against the imperative of survival. Each choice carried consequence, and in the village under siege, every decision had the weight of potential life or death. By midweek, the village had entered a rhythm of perpetual alertness. Children delivered messages as part of play, neighbors coordinated movements in seemingly ordinary routines, and every simple act, feeding animals, repairing roofs, preparing meals, was executed with cautious precision. Life persisted not only as survival but as quiet resistance, a demonstration that even under relentless threat, humanity endured. Yet the shadow of open conflict loomed. Jean-Marc and Lucille observed patrols employing new strategies, using intelligence gleaned from informants and probing for weaknesses. Every step, every glance, every seemingly innocuous act was fraught with risk. The village's endurance now depended on the careful combination of courage, observation, and calculation. Mistakes could cascade into disaster. Hesitation could cost lives. That night, as clouds obscured the moon, Jean-Marc and Lucille huddled in the barn with Renee and a few trusted villagers. Plans were revised, contingencies laid out, and moral choices debated. They understood that survival required a delicate balance: courage without recklessness, action without exposure, and vigilance without despair. The stakes had never been higher, and every shadow, every whisper, carried potential consequence. As snow fell lightly over the village, blanketing it in pale quiet, Jean-Marc realized that the threads of survival were fragile yet persistent. Every act, every decision, and every choice contributed to the tapestry of resilience, endurance, and hope that kept the village alive despite relentless danger, loss, and uncertainty. And in that cold, quiet night, the weight of responsibility pressed heavily on him, tempered only by the steadfast presence of Lucille and the flickering light of determination within the hearts of those who still remained. The morning was gray, the village wrapped in a muted silence that carried the tension of the previous night. Jean-Marc moved cautiously, each footstep crunching softly on the frost-hardened paths, his senses acutely tuned to the environment. The confrontation with the patrol had left invisible scars. Heightened awareness, lingering fear, and the knowledge that even the smallest error could have catastrophic consequences. Plans for supplying distant safe houses and coordinating movements had to be revised. Routes previously considered secure were now compromised, some permanently, forcing Jean-Marc and Lucille to create new paths through dense woods and across frozen fields. Each adjustment carried risk. The village's survival depended on their ability to adapt rapidly, anticipate enemy behavior, and manage the growing fear and fatigue within the community. New threats emerged as well. The soldiers, emboldened by their recent successes, increased patrol frequency and introduced random checks. Informants' movements became bolder, and subtle acts of betrayal, once rare, now became apparent. Jean-Marc observed a neighbor signaling from a window in a way that suggested collusion. The discovery weighed heavily. Trust had always been the backbone of survival, and now it fractured under the weight of fear. Lucille's hand gripped his arm, a reminder that shared vigilance was essential even amidst suspicion. Losses continued to mount. A family providing shelter and food to resistance members disappeared overnight. The village moved silently, executing contingency plans with precision, but each disappearance left a hollow ache, a reminder that even careful strategy could not prevent all tragedy. Children were trained further in secret signals, escape routes rehearsed, and supplies moved or concealed, all while maintaining the fragile appearance of ordinary life. Every mundane act, preparing a meal, tending animals, mending clothing, was now layered with strategy, intention, and silent resilience. Moral dilemmas intensified. Should they risk moving through more heavily patrolled areas to ensure supplies reach those in need, or prioritize the immediate safety of those still in the village? Should hesitant or fearful villagers be compelled to cooperate with the network, knowing that refusal could expose everyone, or should their autonomy be preserved, even at the cost of risk? Jean-Marc and Lucille weighed these questions with constant awareness of the lives dependent on their decisions, navigating the precarious balance between necessity, ethics, and survival. The psychological toll became tangible. Lucille's normally composed demeanor occasionally faltered. She started waking in the night at every distant sound, flinching at shadows that had no immediate threat. Jean-Marc felt the same strain, alert to every movement, every whisper, every footstep, yet aware that constant vigilance could erode resolve and clarity. The endurance of the mind was as vital as the endurance of the body, and both were stretched to their limits. A particularly dangerous incident occurred midweek. While moving critical messages, Jean-Marc and Lucille encountered a small patrol that had deviated from its usual route. They froze behind dense brush, hearts pounding, every muscle tensed. The patrol paused, scanning the area meticulously, seemingly aware of previous routes and possible hidden observers. Jean-Marc signaled Lucille to remain still, guiding her silently through subtle cues. Minutes stretched into agonizing hours, and the patrol finally moved on, leaving a residue of relief mixed with lingering tension. The encounter was a stark reminder that exposure could come from unexpected angles, and that preparation alone could never guarantee safety. Despite these dangers, the village continued to display resilience. Ordinary life persisted under extraordinary conditions. Bread was baked, animals tended, and routines maintained, providing subtle continuity and reassurance amidst chaos. Jean-Marc recognized that this endurance was not mere habit. It was an act of defiance, a quiet assertion that life persisted despite relentless threats and the erosion of security. By the week's end, the village had adapted to the precarious balance between action, observation, and morality. Trust remained fragile but functional. Vigilance and courage intertwined with fear and fatigue to create a tense, delicate equilibrium. Jean-Marc and Lucille understood that survival required constant assessment, rapid adaptation, and the capacity to make impossible choices under pressure. Every decision carried weight, and every act of endurance reinforced the tapestry of resilience that bound the community together. As night fell, cloaking the village in muted darkness, Jean-Marc and Lucille huddled with Renee and a few trusted villagers to plan the next phase of operations. Open threats, hidden betrayals, and the relentless pressure of responsibility pressed upon them. Yet they continued. The threads of courage, strategy, and resilience wove through each choice, sustaining the village in the face of relentless adversity, proving that even amidst loss and fear, life could persist, fragile but unyielding. The night was unusually quiet, the frost sparkling under a pale, hidden moon. Jean-Marc felt the tension in the air, a coiled wire of anticipation and dread. The previous week's events had left the village on edge, and now the threat was no longer distant or abstract. It was approaching with deliberate purpose. By early morning, distant sounds signaled that soldiers were near, boots crunching over frost-hardened ground, shouts echoing faintly through the trees. Jean-Marc and Lucille quickly organized the villagers, guiding them to hidden paths and shelters previously prepared in secrecy. Every movement was deliberate, every instruction precise. The village was a fragile organism now, dependent on coordination, observation, and sheer courage to survive. The first direct assault came with a sudden, brutal efficiency. Soldiers entered the outskirts, searching homes, overturning belongings, and seizing supplies. Shouts, cries, and the harsh commands of authority filled the air. One of the resistance's key allies, a neighbor who had helped coordinate escape routes, was captured despite attempts to guide him to safety. Jean-Marc felt a wave of grief and anger, tempered by the urgent necessity to protect the remaining villagers. Every second counted. Lucille worked beside him, guiding families, signaling children, and moving quietly through the chaos. Their synchronized movements, honed over weeks of careful planning, allowed several villagers to escape into hidden routes, avoiding direct confrontation. Yet the emotional toll was immense. The faces of those lost and the sounds of soldiers' cruelty lingered in their minds, a constant reminder of the stakes. The village, now partially exposed, required improvisation. Jean-Marc made split-second decisions, redirecting villagers through less familiar paths, using smoke from fires to obscure movements, and improvising signals to warn of approaching patrols. Every choice was a gamble, every action carrying potential life-or-death consequences. They moved with urgency, yet the cold and exhaustion made each step heavier, each decision more draining. Losses continued to mount. Another family, cornered by soldiers, was taken despite their attempts to hide. Jean-Marc felt the bitter sting of helplessness, tempered by the necessity to maintain focus and strategy. One lapse could result in the capture or death of dozens more. The moral weight of these choices pressed on him relentlessly. Save a few and risk exposure, or maintain secrecy and risk losing many. Each decision tested the boundaries of courage, ethics, and endurance. By midday, the village's remaining residents were consolidated into hidden areas, relying on previously mapped escape routes and the guidance of Jean-Marc, Lucille, and a few trusted allies. The soldiers, frustrated by the villagers' evasive movements, intensified their search, indicating that this was no longer a routine sweep, but a targeted operation aimed at eliminating resistance activities. Jean-Marc recognized that time was their most precious asset, and every second misused could be fatal. Despite the chaos, the villagers displayed extraordinary resilience. Children followed instructions with precision, neighbors assisted each other silently, and small acts, sharing warmth, moving supplies, communicating hidden messages, continued under extreme duress. Jean-Marc observed these acts with a mix of awe and sorrow, recognizing that survival was as much about courage, collaboration, and ingenuity as it was about avoidance and secrecy. As night fell again, the village lay in fragile silence. The soldiers had withdrawn temporarily, yet the threat lingered like a shadow stretching across the snow-covered streets. Jean-Marc and Lucille huddled with Renee and the remaining trusted villagers to assess losses, adapt strategies, and prepare for the inevitable next engagement. The delicate balance between action, observation, and moral judgment had never been more critical, and the cost of error higher than ever. In the quiet of the night, Jean-Marc reflected on the nature of resilience. Survival was no longer simply hiding or avoiding conflict. It was calculated courage, precise observation, moral fortitude, and the unwavering determination to protect life in the face of relentless adversity. Every decision carried consequence. Every action contributed to a fragile tapestry of endurance, and every moment demanded vigilance, courage, and careful thought. The village was quiet, but the silence carried a weight heavier than the snow-laden sky above. Jean-Marc and Lucille moved through the streets with measured steps, each footfall a careful negotiation with risk. The attacks of the previous days had left the village fractured, the network of trust and coordination strained to its limits. Every movement, every glance, and every whisper had the potential to expose them to further danger. Strategic losses became painfully apparent. Key supply caches had been discovered and destroyed, hidden routes had been compromised, and a number of trusted allies had been captured or disappeared. The map of safety they had relied on for months was no longer reliable. Jean-Marc realized that the village's survival now depended on improvisation, rapid adaptation, and the ability to anticipate enemy movements in ways they had never faced before. Tensions among the villagers intensified. Fear, grief, and exhaustion mingled in conversations and glances. Some argued for retreat, suggesting that dispersing into nearby forests and farms might offer greater safety. Others insisted on maintaining their positions, emphasizing the importance of cohesion, secrecy, and continued resistance. Jean-Marc and Lucille listened carefully, balancing conflicting voices while considering the practical implications of every decision. Leadership in these circumstances was not about authority. It was about guiding, persuading, and protecting through uncertainty. The immediate threat escalated when a patrol returned, this time moving with precise knowledge of the village's geography and prior hiding spots. Jean-Marc and Lucille quickly organized a system of diversions and signals to redirect villagers to less exposed locations. Smoke from small fires, the subtle shifting of shutters, and carefully timed noises all became part of an intricate dance of evasion. Each movement required exact timing and coordination, and a single misstep could result in capture or worse. During this period, new moral dilemmas emerged. Should they risk sending children along hidden paths to deliver messages, knowing that the act could be fatal if discovered? Should hesitant villagers be compelled to participate in coordinated moves, even at the risk of rebellion or exposure? Jean-Marc and Lucille debated quietly, aware that their decisions would define not only survival, but the ethical integrity of their actions. Every choice carried life or death consequences. Despite these challenges, the resilience of the village was remarkable. Ordinary routines, feeding animals, preparing meals, maintaining warmth, continued under a veil of strategy and caution. Children carried out messages disguised as play, neighbors coordinated subtle signals, and every minor act of normalcy became a statement of defiance. Jean-Marc understood that courage was not only in confrontation or evasion, but in the persistent continuation of life under relentless threat. By midweek, the village had adapted to a new rhythm, a tense equilibrium of observation, careful action, and moral calculation. Jean-Marc and Lucille reviewed patrol patterns, mapped alternative routes, and developed contingency plans for both supply runs and sheltering the most vulnerable. Every decision was informed by the delicate balance of safety, necessity, and the village's endurance. The psychological strain was now undeniable. Lucille occasionally flinched at distant noises, her sleep broken by imagined patrols. Jean-Marc felt the pressure of leadership in every choice, weighed by grief for lost allies and the responsibility of safeguarding those who remained. Every day demanded not only courage but a relentless clarity of mind and the ability to act decisively under intense stress. As night fell, the village lay in tense silence. Snow-covered rooftops and muted streets provided both camouflage and constraint, hiding movement while limiting options. Jean-Marc and Lucille gathered with Renee and the remaining trusted villagers to reassess strategies, redistribute responsibilities, and prepare for future threats. The stakes had never been higher. Survival now depended on the ability to anticipate, adapt, and act with precision. In the quiet, fragile hours of the night, Jean-Marc reflected on the lessons of the past weeks. Survival was no longer simply about hiding. It was about courage under pressure, strategic calculation, moral clarity, and the relentless pursuit of endurance. Every shadow, every sound, and every act carried consequence, forming the intricate web of life, resilience, and hope that sustained the village even in the darkest times. Winter had deepened, blanketing the village in a layer of cold that seemed to press upon every roof, street, and frozen field. The weeks of tension, loss, and relentless vigilance had shaped the village into a place where even silence was a form of strategy. Jean-Marc moved through the streets one last time, each step a careful negotiation between fear, necessity, and endurance. The threat that had loomed for so long now arrived in full force. Soldiers, emboldened and systematic, swept through the outskirts with the precision of months of intelligence and observation. The village, already fractured and diminished, faced what felt like an impossible moment. Jean-Marc and Lucille, side by side, coordinated every movement, every signal, every diversion. Years of learned vigilance and strategy condensed into hours of critical action. Families moved along hidden paths, children guided silently, and trusted allies took calculated risks to draw patrols away from the most vulnerable. Smoke signals from carefully placed fires, shifting shutters, and subtle noises orchestrated a ballet of evasion. Each second carried the weight of life or death. Jean-Marc understood that every decision now would resonate far beyond the immediate moment. Tragedy struck once again. A home that had been a refuge for many was discovered, and those inside were taken despite precautions. Jean-Marc felt the familiar surge of grief and helplessness, tempered by the urgency of continuing the operation. Every step, every diversion, and every quiet act of protection was amplified in consequence. Lucille's hand gripped his, a reminder of solidarity, courage, and the fragile trust that had endured despite relentless strain. The villagers displayed remarkable resilience. Even in the face of terror, they continued their routines, feeding animals, sharing warmth, moving messages, integrating survival and resistance into the fabric of daily life. Children, guided and protected, carried out small but critical tasks, while neighbors communicated in subtle, careful gestures. Jean-Marc recognized that these acts, seemingly ordinary, were acts of profound courage. Life itself had become the ultimate defiance. By nightfall, the immediate threat had passed, but the cost was evident. The village had lost many, and the landscape of trust and coordination had shifted irreversibly. Yet the remaining villagers gathered quietly, assessing what had survived, what could be rebuilt, and how to continue. Jean-Marc and Lucille, weary but resolute, led the reflection and planning, understanding that endurance required both mourning and action. In the stillness of the night, as snow fell silently over rooftops and streets, Jean-Marc reflected on what had been learned. Courage was not only in confronting danger but in the persistence of life, in careful calculation, in moral clarity under pressure, and in the unwavering determination to protect others. The village had endured despite loss, fear, and relentless threat, not because danger had been absent, but because those who remained chose to act with courage, wisdom, and humanity. The final hours of the story left the village fragile, yet alive. Each surviving thread of life, trust, and resilience formed a delicate tapestry, showing that even in the darkest times, hope could persist. Jean-Marc and Lucille, alongside the remaining villagers, understood that survival was both a gift and a responsibility, and that the endurance of their community, though costly, was a quiet testament to human perseverance. As the first pale light of dawn touched the snow, the village lay in a hush of fragile peace. Shadows still lingered, danger was not fully gone, yet life continued, resilient, careful, and luminous in its quiet persistence. Jean-Marc gazed at the horizon, knowing that history would remember not only the losses but the courage, endurance, and unyielding spirit of those who had refused to surrender to fear.